Well, welcome everybody to Big Questions, Big Ideas. My name's Jackson Bartlett. I'm assistant professor of honors social sciences and at Ball State, and I also teach in the African American Studies program. I've been in Muncie since 2018, and I think it's starting to feel like home, thanks to everyone's hospitality. And so just thank you for being here tonight. I know it's Friday, it's 5:30, it's winter time, and we're on Zoom and Facebook Live. So I appreciate you being here for this conversation. So I'm going to keep it pretty casual. I'm working through some new ideas and some things that I've been dealing with in my teaching and scholarship and activism. And so we'll see how long that takes. And then I want to have a discussion with you all afterwards, if that's possible. So tonight I'm going to talk about something that I think everyone in the room has heard about before, and that's the idea that our society is becoming increasingly polarized, that it's become more divided politically, socially, culturally, economically, geographically. We're used to hearing about this, right? And the idea that this division needs to be remedied if we're going to move past many of the most challenging issues of our day, like the pandemic or widespread social unrest. I'm going to share my screen with you. So, I broke my own rule with having really clear titles. This one's the problem with polarization, false equivalency in the age of Black Lives Matter. And so we see this every day in the media. We see this discussion about our society being too polarized, right? So America's being pulled apart. How can we heal our nation? The Associated Press has this whole series on divided America, saying that Americans are more divided than ever. I think this is from USA Today. We have to come together and unite. And I'm going to talk about this from a couple of different angles based on the different hats that I wear in my life. The first is as a social scientist committed to thinking through social problems and finding solutions to those problems. The second is as a teacher. So I teach on anti-racism and I teach in Black studies. I teach on global inequality. So I'm in the classroom every day with my students trying to think through some of these issues, and that sparked a lot of these ideas for tonight. And then it's also as an activist. And so thinking this through according to my own ethical and moral convictions, right? And so my chief argument today is that polarization is actually not a fact of our political culture in the US as it's presented. But instead, it's actually a false narrative about our society that has served to obscure some of the inequalities driving that division, right? And it has muted calls for human rights by rendering them as too extreme. It's a trope that's often repeated by white liberals who might mean well, but who are kind of unwilling to commit to social change, right? This idea that we should all come together is a little more palatable than talking about some of the actual issues that are driving us apart. And so I want to offer a little definition of the polarization narrative here, the way that I define it. The polarization narrative is an account of increasing social unrest and political division that locates the cause of that division in the unwillingness of either side to compromise, to listen, to understand one another, or to otherwise come together. It's a narrative. I call it a narrative because it's an account of something, right? It's a tale of disagreement, so to speak. And I call it a polarization narrative instead of just a division narrative or something else, because it's rooted in the idea that both sides have drifted to the poles, right, to the extremes of both positions. It's not just that we're divided, but it's that the left has moved so far left and the right has moved so far right. And how can we reconcile this, right? So that's the polarization narrative. It casts our political climate as a war of extremes, and then it attributes that drift to things like tribalism. I'm sure you've all heard this word before, or stubbornness, or to hate. We just don't like one another. or identity, right? We're just so attached to being a liberal or a conservative, and we can't get over that. And people just can't get along anymore. Here's a piece from the Atlantic. Oh, I don't have it. I was just going to show you another example, talking about increasing tribalism in the United States, right? So you might be thinking, what's the problem? This sounds right to me, right? The US is really divided. We've had, the Trump caravans going through campus a couple of weeks ago. We've had the protests and the march this June in Muncie. But there are a couple fatal errors that underpin this narrative and some logical fallacies. The first error of the polarization narrative is that it identifies division as the problem, right? I've already mentioned this, not inequality or injustice or the underlying social problems. And if division is the problem, then agreement must be the solution, right? Not remedying the social problems, but we need to agree. Division's the problem, agreement's the solution. So I've just got a little graphic showing what the polarization narrative represents. Suggests that this is where we are as a society. Oh, there's the tribalism slide. So it casts the problems as division, tribalism, a failure to listen, extremism, and echo chambers. How many of you have heard this? I mean, we're always hearing that we're all stuck in our echo chambers, and that's the real problem, right? And so then the solution must be listening, understanding, debate, considering opposing viewpoints, and compromise. Now, these sound like really positive things, right? And the point of this talk isn't to suggest that we shouldn't listen, that we shouldn't understand each other, or that we shouldn't debate, or that we shouldn't consider opposing viewpoints. Just that these solutions are often introduced as a substitute, right, for social change. So what the polarization narrative does is it puts the cart before the horse, right? It bypasses truth, facts, ethics, morals, and jumps right to the conflict resolution. This can also be described, or it leads to what's called middle grounding. So middle grounding is the idea that the middle ground between two extremes is correct because it is the middle ground. Both positions are incorrect because they are extreme. So we could think this through with a couple of examples. So I have a colleague, Adam Cuban, here at Ball State, and who thinks this through a lot when it comes to climate and climate change. If the overwhelming scientific evidence and consensus is that climate change exists and that it's caused by the human emission of greenhouse gases, and then the other position is that it doesn't exist, right? The middle ground is actually inaccurate, right? Because the evidence supports one of the sides. But this sort of middle grounding and this idea that we should move to the center would have us give unequal weight to the left. We could think about this when it comes to vaccines as well, right? There's a group that thinks that vaccines cause autism and have other types of risk that comes with the vaccine. And then the overwhelming evidence shows that that's not the case. The middle ground isn't necessarily the correct answer in that instance. Same thing with things like mask orders, right? We know that masks prevent the transmission of the virus, of COVID-19 and other viruses, and a middle ground doesn't make a whole lot of sense in that kind of argument. So that's the first thing that the polarization narrative does. The second error is actually another logical fallacy. So the polarization narrative engages in what's known as both sidism or false balance. By suggesting that the two positions have moved equally far towards the poles, the polarization narrative blames both sides of a debate for the social division, right? So it identifies the social division as the problem, and then both groups are equally responsible because they're both extreme. And we often hear this as, the good old days, the right and the left were, the right and the left were here and everyone got along and we could reach across the aisle, right? And now we have these extremes. Yet when you look at the actual positions of the political parties over the years, you see a shift from the class compromise of the middle 20th century. Okay, we're going to keep capitalism, but we want a large middle class with high rates of consumption. So we'll allow for certain forms of regulation. We might raise the minimum wage or create a minimum wage, right? Various New Deal and Great Society policies. This is the class compromise, the middle 20th century. Union membership was strong. And we see a shift from that to the Washington Consensus of the Reagan years onward. So this is where both parties support free trade, limited government spending, austerity, privatization, deregulation, and so on. So this would be the Democratic Party on the left here of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. Although we're not sure yet. We don't know where Joe Biden's going to go. It's only been a couple weeks, right? And so you have a party of compromise on the left, right? And what's happened is that the window of what is deemed acceptable has shifted to the right. So we've got the class compromise, the Washington Consensus after Reagan. And then with Trump, the right has gotten more and more extreme. Now we know that this preceded Donald Trump, but he's sort of the apotheosis of this process here. So compromise moves further and further to the right. It's not actually the case that both parties have moved to the polls. Instead, what you have is a party of compromise, the Democrats, for better or for worse, right? And then you have the party of extremes, the new Republicans. So basic proposals that were taken for granted in the 1960s, like a living wage, affordable college education, are now deemed socialist, or they're deemed too extreme to make it into the political debate. So things that were once considered reasonable are now considered extreme, versus both sides just sort of moving to the other side. So the polarization narrative has obscured the ways that the right has been able to reset the terms over the past 40 or 50 years. But what does this have to do with Black Lives Matter? I said this was going to be a talk about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a decentralized social movement consisting of Black people and allies who are committed to various anti-racist ideas, most of all police reform. It's not a group. It doesn't have a leader, although there might be some Black Lives Matter groups out there. It's not a single group. And many powerful figures have emerged to push its anti-racist agenda, but it's not a centralized group. Black Lives Matter is our civil rights movement for Black and brown people in this country. It's a movement for human rights like due process, freedom of movement, fair treatment under the law, police oversight, social services, jobs, housing, and a social safety net. It's also a movement that has fallen prey to the polarization narrative. This is Muncie, by the way. This is that beautiful march from the summer. So what do I mean that Black Lives Matter has fallen prey to this polarization narrative? Black Lives Matter tends to surface in polarization narratives as evidence of increasing extremism on the left. So regardless of the legitimacy of what anti-racist activists are calling for, or the merit of their claims, the fact that there is a vociferous opposition to those claims is read as evidence that the left has gone too far. So because people are mad about Black Lives Matter, that must mean that the left has gone too far to the left. Black Lives Matter is thus blamed, at least in part, for the increasing division in our society. So that's how it surfaces within, or how it's talked about within the polarization narrative. Yet when we examine the claims made by Black Lives Matter activists and anti-racists more broadly, which again are diverse, it's a broad-based movement, what we often see, though, is the mere reassertion of existing equality under the law. We see a rehashing of decades-old claims for access to jobs and opportunity. We see an insistence on fair treatment and due process, an end to police brutality, And while we have seen increased demands for economic redistribution, even those are tame compared to the left in Western Europe and many other countries. In other words, the mainstream left largely has sought to restore the ideals of the Great Society and the New Deal at its most extreme. On the other hand, when we examine politics on the right, we see a dramatic shift to the right, not just in the 1970s with the Washington Consensus, but over the past few years as well. And again, we know that the right is diverse. There are people who are more moderate and people who are more extreme, but overall, we've seen a drift towards the right. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports that in the last 4 years, white nationalist hate groups have increased 55% from 2017 to 2019. The number of anti-LGBT hate groups rose 43% in a single year from 2018 to 2019. In July 2020, the US State Department and UN Security Councils reported a dramatic rise of hate crimes and what they refer to as white supremacist terrorism since 2015, including racially and ethnically motivated attacks, attacks on immigrants, religious minorities, and LGBTQ groups. A recent FBI report suggests that bias killings are at a record high, and that anti-Jewish hate crimes are up 14% year over year. In his recent book on the far right in America, University of Georgia professor Cass Mudd has tracked the increasing use of extreme rhetoric among governors and legislators across the US, indicating a mainstreaming of anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant, and racist rhetoric within the Republican Party. And this is within the mainstream, right? These are elected officials. The Republican platform matches the rhetoric. Since his election in 2016, Donald Trump has called for closing the border with Mexico, banning critical race theory in schools, and locking up his political opponents. And then we see these senators in particular, right, who are at lockstep with Donald Trump. So while the left has mostly held fast to its convictions, albeit with maybe a leftward shift towards the Keynesian policies of the mid-century with Sanders and Warren's campaigns, and with Black Lives Matter, the right has been completely transformed by its most extreme members. In other words, there's no empirical evidence suggesting polarization in the way that it's often described by the polarization narrative. The middle, it seems, is moving significantly to the right. So how do we actually get out of this trap? This is what I've really been thinking through a lot lately because I'm teaching on these subjects often in school, and students will say, oh, you need to teach both sides, or, you know, how do we teach, how do we talk, how do we think outside of the polarization narrative where we create a false equivalency between both positions for human rights and positions against human rights? Well, the first is to focus on social problems instead of just focusing on division around those social problems. Only by determining the cause, consequence, and nature of a social problem, like climate change or the spread of a virus, can we begin to make a good case for what should be done about it. Here's an example. So within the polarization narrative, here's a comment about Black Lives Matter. There's all this rioting and protesting. People just need to understand each other better. People need to listen to one another more. So the focus here is on not getting along, not on the claims that activists are making for human rights, right? Like basic human rights, bodily autonomy, safety, and end to police brutality, right? And police killings. An alternative way of thinking about this could be, okay, decades of racial profiling, police violence, and economic dissatisfaction among the working classes are driving social unrest. So these issues are what's driving social unrest. Inequality is what's driving the social unrest and the protests and the claims and the activism. The issues are unjust and should be remedied for the good of society. Two very different ways of looking at this. The second suggestion is to evaluate positions and claims based on evidence rather than out of a desire to respect or give space to all opinions. Now, not arguing that we need to stop respecting one another, right? Or stop listening to one another. Just that we don't give weight to an opinion that's not due to that opinion, right? Based on the evidence. I do this in the classroom all the time. One student thinks racism doesn't exist. Another student thinks it does. Well, I don't just drop racism on the table and say, let's debate it, right? What each student thinks tells me nothing about whether or not racism is a thing. Do I have to give equal weight to both opinions? I don't think so. I invite those students to use evidence to back up their claims. And here's a hint. There's no evidence to prove the negative, that racism doesn't exist. But there's mountains of evidence that details the emergence of race as an idea in the modern world and the use of racism as a tool of social control for hundreds of years. Sorry, but racism is a thing. And when I start this way, students actually respond pretty well. I usually start my classes by saying, you know, we work on some ground rules together. And one of the rules that I layer in is that we're going to begin with a set of evidence-based assumptions. So racism, sexism, homophobia are a thing. They exist. We're going to examine, once we start with that assumption, now we're going to examine where they come from, how they operate, right? And we're going to use evidence to have that discussion. The third suggestion is a political one. I can stop sharing my screen here. The third suggestion is to take control of the terms of the debate around the value of Black lives and racial justice. Now, people are already doing this, right? This isn't my original idea, but it's a suggestion that we pay more attention to this and do more of it. The polarization narrative casts Black Lives Matter as a partisan position, just as it casts masks, lockdowns, climate change, and other issues as partisan, rather than as issues we could debate scientifically or historically using evidence. As long as it's partisan, it's criticized for being divisive, right? Yet the vision of this social movement is rooted in principles around human rights, fairness, and equality. Just like mask wearing is built on sound principles of epidemiology and public health. It's not an opinion. It's not a matter of opinion, right? Black Lives Matter is about building a better world for all, not just for one side or the other. It's not about winning necessarily, although right, taking power is a component of this. And so I think that for those of us who are committed to racial justice, we have to refuse the characterization of these fundamental values as tribal, as divisive, as about winning or losing, if we're to escape the trap of the polarization narrative. This alternative framing of the movement is one that's, you know, this framing is happening on the left, right? Is one that's focused on building solidarity, not by conceding, right, to extreme right-wing views and to increasingly right-wing views or increasingly extreme views. But it's built by building the case for this vision of a better world. So at this point, I don't know if we do discussion, because I know there's a Facebook Live stream going on as well, but that's all I have. So I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Jackson. Yes, we can do a discussion with the people who are directly in the Zoom. Unfortunately, the people who are watching over Facebook Live cannot ask questions. It's up to you whether you want to take your own questions from the several dozen people we have here on Zoom, or whether you want me to moderate.
Yeah, I can just take questions. I've been on Zoom for months now, so pretty used to it.
Sure. Well, who would like to start?
I'm happy to. Hi, this is Christy McGillivray. I don't have my video on because my Zoom keeps crashing if I have my video on, so apologies, everyone. My question, Jackson, some of the rhetoric that I've heard about the recent election really centers on the perceived damage that the defund the police slogan did to Democrats. What is, given like the structure of the argument that you just laid out, what is your take on the damage that those, you know, perceived radical slogans may have had on, you know, marginal Democrats in swing seats?
Yeah, so I'm not a political scientist, so the actual impact on those Democrats in swing seats, I can't really speak to, but I think that it relates to this idea, and that, you know, Barack Obama came out and had a big critique of this phrase, defund the police, and Biden's criticized it. I think it's very related because it's focused on the division that framing of the issue causes, and it's not focused on the actual problem at hand. It's a distraction. And to me, it's the very trap, I think, that white liberals and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and by this I mean liberal versus progressive, I think it's the trap that they / we, I don't know, keep falling into.
That's helpful. So you wind up in a rhetorical debate about how the argument lands instead of addressing the actual material reasons for the argument in the first place.
Yeah, and it places responsibility on the left, on Black Lives Matter protesters, on activists, on intellectuals, and it makes them responsible for people's unwillingness to change the policy, right? It's your fault because you didn't frame it correctly. It's your fault because you're being divisive with this language. When I'm not sure what other language they would like to see other than like more social services. Maybe that's we could replace it with more social services.
So, Matt Hotham here. Lovely talk, really interesting stuff. I'm in the Department of Religious Studies and I'm an Islamicist, so some of this stuff hits home in my own teaching as well. One thing I'd like to help me think through is this question of evidence-based argumentation, because I think Islamic studies is one of these interesting cases where there's a whole cottage industry of generating easily accessible, incorrect evidence that you can find on the internet to support Islamophobic arguments. And so I think there's this in relation to ideas about racism as well, right? If you want to, you can find things on the internet that would say racism isn't real or isn't as bad a problem as the liberal media makes it out to be. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you frame what counts as evidence in a world where there are organizations and groups and individuals trying to throw fact-like things in the direction of people to muddy the waters.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's why we need scientific literacy to be a component of our teaching, right? And of our debate. And that kind of goes hand in hand with media literacy too, right? So another really big aspect of my teaching, because usually I have students do research papers, is a discussion of what makes a credible source, what makes a study valid, reliable. All of those questions have to be embedded in this so that students aren't just bringing, well, I saw this on Breitbart and I saw this on Huffington Post and I saw this on CNN. My colleagues and I were always having discussions about how to read the news and maybe previous generations understanding the difference between an editorial and reporting versus analysis. That's the one I struggle with a lot with my students, is reporting versus analysis. What makes it primary, what makes it secondary. So I think that's really crucial here.
Can I just press a little bit on that though? Because I'd be interested to see like what kind of guidelines you give to students, because it seems like, given this polarization argument that you talked about, they could say, well, you're telling me that the only thing that counts as evidence are things that my sources or my background are telling me are left polarized sources. You're telling me the New York Times is valid, but Fox News isn't. You're telling me an academic paper is valid, but a right-wing think tank isn't. And so that could be read as just re-entrenching the polarization narrative by some of them. Does that make sense as a question?
It does.
And I don't know, it's a thorny one. I don't know that
Yeah.
it's answerable at this moment, but.
I mean, on one level, they have to go deeper than just thinking of the source as reliable or not. They have to be, that's why they need that scientific literacy as well. And that logical, for folks in philosophy, like they have to be able to evaluate an argument. So they need that. And then some of it's just like tough luck, right? Like this has been peer reviewed and this hasn't, like we have to understand that as well. There's also bad science done that's peer reviewed. So, it needs to be a both and. if I had more time with them, I mean, I taught this methods course when I was at Northwestern where I had them read news reports on studies. And then sometimes the reports misrepresented the studies. Sometimes the studies were bad. Sometimes the, and just going through all of that messiness, it's overwhelming for them. But I just keep telling them, you know, you have to just keep checking and thinking it through to its logical conclusion and testing, you know, how asking how this person came to these conclusions. And we might not always agree. That might not always lead to truth, you know, but it hopefully will help us have a stronger debate.
Jackson, thank you so much for this, you know, this really clear presentation in such an important issue right now. Sarah Vitale, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. You know, I think that I've become a little bit disheartened lately in the project of reason. And this is unfortunate because I've put all of my life in the project of reason. But right now we're hearing reports that only 20% of Trump supporters believe that the election results are legitimate, even when Barr is saying there is no evidence. And so the idea that there could be evidence somewhere that no one has found yet seems so convincing. And I believe that, you know, Spinoza, you know, hundreds of years ago told us, well, yeah, duh, like we're not ruled as much by reason as we are by our passions. You know, we spend very little time, but yet all of us spend our days and you know, years trying to teach rational argumentation to students. And you know, I think that I'm a little bit, maybe it's just the end of the semester and this kind of political moment that we're in, but I share a lot of Matt's concerns. And I think that, you know, how do we talk about how, you know, I don't teach public speaking, but they talk about pathos and ethos so much. And, you know, maybe that's something that the rest of us should be doing some as well, to be considering how much emotion comes into accepting certain arguments as true or not.
Yeah. It's a really tough question. And I think we have work to do on a more macro level of like, what does our media landscape look like and why? You know, I mean, that's political. Our media landscape was deregulated in 1996, and that has a lot to do with where we are today. Our politics, our political system. I mean, when the vast majority of Americans support things like gun control, abortion rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet our politicians are in a completely different, like their Overton window's over here and the public's is over here. That's a problem too, right? So issues like gerrymandering. I mean, Christy's here, she's from Michigan. She's doing a lot of really hard work politically on the ground to try to get those types of things changed. And so maybe it's, I don't know, maybe I'm a little pessimistic when it comes to like the one-on-one individual changing of minds, but it's like we need a zeitgeist that's a little more information driven or maybe more reason based. And that's a political question or a question of political strategy, I guess. Other questions or comments?
You know, I have a immediate thought, you know, as you two were talking about that, you know, this like lack of reason and where we're at. And just as a total side, because, you know, we're being conversational because why not? But I just wonder, there's so much happening right now that seems to like parallel really predictable responses in human behavior that we know are possible and we know will happen. So, you know, on one hand, human beings are capable of reason and logic. And on the other hand, like cults are a thing. So both of these things are possible at all points in time. And it's just a question of what we're feeding and not. And I think, Jackson, you're totally right. We have to focus on these bigger picture responses to policy that are going to restructure the way that people are interacting with information and make it possible for people to actually have access in a meaningful way to information that is reasonable. You know, the fairness doctrine going away was one, you know, thing, but the totally unregulated media environment that is social media is another too. And that's just completely unchecked and unhinged. So I think that for just some background, at one point I was teaching in public school, and I had a lot of students that were flat earthers, and I was teaching chemistry and physics. And nothing like getting into a debate with high school students about whether or not the earth is flat. Needless to say, it went very badly. But, you know, it's at that point, it's not a conversation about whether or not the earth is flat. It's a conversation about the student's identity and your identity, and the fact that those two things are clashing. And that's not going to get. So there's the, you know, preserving the relationship with the cult follower that you're talking to that believes the earth is flat, which will hopefully give you an in the future to have a conversation about, you know, what is and isn't real. And then there's, you know, changing the media environment that created all these like completely insane YouTube videos that this poor 15-year-old kid was responding to. So, you know, if anything, I think trying to maintain those personal relationships while not losing focus on the fact that there have to be these big structural changes, or those individual conversations are just going to keep getting crazier.
Yeah. And, you know, you raise social media, and I'm thinking about the flat earthers and like the YouTube and the groups that they're on and all of that. And maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, but I think that that's an echo chamber. And that echo chamber is not equivalent to my echo chamber, which is NPR and like scientific journals. It's not equivalent. And that's a fundamental problem in the debate, is that, you know, we all just need to get out of our echo chambers. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that it's the same thing. And that doesn't mean that NPR is always right. That doesn't mean that I'm always right. And it doesn't mean that the left is always right. But there is something that's happening in that social media landscape that's toxic and that's reinforcing misinformation. And that's not the same as spaces that reinforce, you know, questions and reporting and science.
I think too, can I speak, Jackson? Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's not the same. I think one of the problems that we're struggling with is a real anti-intellectual, not even undercurrent in this country. And so it's going to be a hard sell, I think, for a lot of people, like the flat earthers, to say, well, that's not reasonable when mom and dad believe that, grandma and grandpa believe that, and everyone around you believes that. And so I think that a lot of times, especially for our students, there's a real struggle for them when they go to college or when they're in high school. It's a struggle that I, as a first generation college student, faced. It's a struggle that I know our students are facing. It's about belonging to a particular group of people, right? It's not really even about what you believe. It's about what you say you believe, and it's about, you know, fitting in with a family. And I know that I had a talk with one of my friends on social media. She's about my age, and she has a mother who I really love and I respect a great deal. But her mother had said to her that she was destroying the family because she wasn't a Trump supporter. And this is the kind of, I mean, that's an emotional pressure that our students recognize, that people recognize, and it's very, very hard to fight it. And it's very hard to convince a young person, or even a person my age, that, you know, you can stand separate, you can stand apart from that in some way. So, I mean, I think the struggle is not, I think it is an emotional struggle for a lot of people. It's not that they don't necessarily recognize intellectually the rightness of the argument that we might be making. It's that, you know, there is a belonging, and a belonging to a particular group of people that really matters to them. And not only does it matter, sort of emotionally, it might matter financially too. I mean, if you are a business owner, if you're going to be a business owner in a particular community, you know, you'd better look like you believe certain things, you know. And so I think that's it's a very complex problem. And I'm not sure how much people actually believe in these arguments they're saying. I think it's like a rallying cry a lot of times, and I think it is part of belonging to a group. So I'll shut up now.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it raises the other question about what, and maybe it's related to what we were talking about before, like what are people being handed? What is the infrastructure that they're being handed in terms of identity and in terms of, you know, beliefs and in terms of their politics? And this is why I was so heartened by Sanders and Warren's success, is that I hoped that ultimately, if they were nominated, they'd be able to offer people something else than this just red meat conservatism. And, you know, the data doesn't really bear out that like Bernie voters voted for Trump. Like that's not as big as people like to make it. But I think there are a lot of people who don't vote, right, in rural areas, rural Indiana, for instance, who might vote if they were being handed another thing to belong to or another thing to believe in that maybe wasn't as toxic and wasn't as negative. And so that's why, you know, through white liberalism and into the title here, I don't think it's offering people anything, right? It's just there, and it's about appeasement and peace and calm and getting along. But people want more right now.
I don't think that, you know, again, I think about this a lot because I'm a first generation college student. I feel that pull a lot. And I don't live in a big town. I live in the country. I live, you know, in the middle of two neighbors who are flying Trump flags, you know, and they, you know, and one of my neighbors was raffling off an AR-15 at the local fair a year ago, you know, that kind of thing. And so I think one of the things that we don't do a particularly good job of, and I'm speaking for universities in particular, is we don't do a good job of speaking to and speaking for people who live in these rural communities. I think, and I think that the kind of intellectual, how would I say this? The kind of intellectual work that we do at universities is particularly well advertised, and therefore it's not respected. And I think not only is that true, I think it is also true that that sometimes people from these communities are intimidated by the ivory tower, and that creates anger, you know, and frustration on their part. And I know that as you know, as a student myself, listening to some of my professors say things to me, like one time I had a professor in my department who said to me, I come from the same community that Haven Kimmel comes from. And when he was talking to me, he goes, "Oh, well, I guess there are two smart people that came from Moreland, Indiana." And I thought, you know, you didn't win a friend there. You know, that's not a smart thing to say. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I think gets folks up in arms and helps create that sort of ugly dynamic that I think I have seen most of my life, actually. That doesn't mean that anti-intellectual is good or right, but it does mean that I don't think we do a particularly good job of selling what we do and why it matters.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great point. And I think one thing that maybe we could do, those of us who are here who are educators, is if we think about, you know, we talk about anti-intellectualism, but we mention flat eartherism and QAnon, and those are intellectual-ish methodologically, right?
Mm.
So it's maybe more anti-elitism than anti-intellectualism. You know, we're a group of people who are affectively drawn to rational arguments, to research, to investigation. Yet we seem to struggle drawing our students or our communities into the joy of engaging in that. Yet they're doing it on Facebook, they're doing it on Reddit, they're doing it elsewhere. And maybe one of the barriers to entry into a community of people who have an affective engagement with rationality, with facts, is that we're perceived as being snooty. It's expensive to join this club. Our journals and the research information that you have to access are all paywalled, whereas the stuff that you find on the internet isn't. So I wonder if that's part of the problem too, is that the barrier to entry into our community that enjoys engaging in rational argument is so much higher than in these other communities where they can do a thing that feels affectively the same without the snootiness and without having to pay thousands of dollars to access it.
Yeah. I read something recently, I can't remember where it was, but about the joy that people get out of some of these conspiracy theories. You you feel smart, right? You feel smarter than everybody else because you know something that not everybody else knows, and you're on the internet and you're doing your, research, and you're digging, and you're pulling up all this stuff, and you have a lot to say to, I have a lot of guy friends from my hometown are really into this sort of thing, right? And it makes you feel important and smart. And so I think that's a really good point, that there probably is a hunger for intellectualism broadly. But again, our media landscape is just poisoning that and giving people options that maybe shouldn't be as widely available.
Hi, Professor Bartlett. I'm Emmy. I'm one of the honors students. I totally agree with Professor Matthew, what he just said, how I do think that it's elitism in a sense because, college is so expensive to come to, and conspiracy theories are kind of fun sometimes. You feel like, oh, I know this tea. And I think that can cause a rift and a certain sense of polarization between people. And again, that's not the problem, but I think that does it makes people feel upset. So I thought that was a really interesting point. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, thanks, Emmy. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
So, Jackson, I would like to ask you about something I'm going to call social division and distinguish it from the kind of division that pertains to polarization that you started talking about in the very beginning of your presentation. I found your presentation extremely helpful because it was so clear in isolating some of the rhetorical difficulties that are involved in our contemporary political discourse, and especially where it comes to your explaining how it seems like sometimes there's a leftward movement when there hasn't been one. And all of that was really terrific. But I think that polarization is very different from what I'm calling social division. So I want to explain what social division is. Social division is an increase in the separation among people in specific communities, a decrease in the sense of belonging that people have in specific communities. And I think that we have had a pretty significant increase in social division in recent years. I think the Trump administration, has divided families, it's divided friend groups in a way that no political events and no social events in my lifetime have done so. I've recently stopped communicating I've lost friends of 30 plus years over this. And I think, if you had said to me a decade ago that I would, or even 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago, that I would stop being friends with these people over here because of politics, that would have seemed outrageous. How would I lose friends of 30 years over politics? I already know what their politics are. But the political moment that we're living in right now is divisive in that sense. And I think the divisions that take place there have little to do with the political polarization that you started talking about. And, like Black Lives Matter, defund the police. Defund the police sounds like a radical proposal when it really isn't, because of yada, yada, yada. Like all that's brilliant. And I'm even going to take some of that from you, but I still think we're left with this social division, and I don't know what to say about it. I mean, I think some of this was addressed by what Beth and Christy are talking about, because they're talking about the individual struggles that people are going with and the identity changes that people are making. And I'm undergoing my own identity struggle belatedly here in middle age, and I might be too old to call myself middle aged, but in any case, it's like Sarah, thank you. In any case, I feel like the identity struggle is not me changing my views, but it's me changing who my friends are. So it's and me changing my sense of myself as someone who relates to people where I came from. Even though I live in the ivory tower, and even though my political views are something that could be described as radical by certain other people, I thought, well, that didn't matter before. I'm still friends with these people. I'm still friends with the people back home. I still go back in the summer. I still hang out with these people. We still have our text message threads, and this last election cycle blew that up in a way that was unfathomable before. And I'm kind of left wondering, okay, so now I have to rethink myself and think I'm now somebody who only affiliates with, if you go through my texts, if you go through my emails, like I only affiliate with people in a narrow political, like who are in a narrow sliver of the political spectrum. And I don't think that that's a product of political polarization. I think it's a product of social division. It's a product of the way families have broken apart over Trump. I hate to put a name on it, like as if it's his fault. But he's the symbol of it at the very least. He's not the cause of it, but he's the symbol of it. And I don't know. So I don't have a clear question. That's kind of my response, is that like, you're right, but that kind of divisiveness is like Fox News versus MSNBC. And that's not this other problem that we have going on, which is social division, which is that there won't be friendships, there won't be marriages, and across the aisle, so to speak, right? It's like, are we living in a society where people are actually selecting their friends in a politically loaded way, where people are engaging in relationships in a politically loaded way because we've all become so sensitive around our political identities that we don't even know how to like put that aside.
Yeah, I hear that. And I guess what I would say to that is that, maybe the goal isn't to minimize the division or not deal with it, but that we have this sort of false attribution of responsibility, that it's just as much my problem as someone who believes in human rights as it is a white nationalist problem. And it's just not, in my estimation, right? Like, I feel like the world, and maybe this is what you're getting at, like the world has kind of drifted, whereas, things that we previously thought were reasonable are now being questioned, or now forcing us into a position where we're losing family and friends. And so I think we need to focus on the rise of white nationalism, the rise of far right conservatism, as the cause of that, right? And not necessarily our own decreasing willingness to engage. I think that the left is very good at self-flagellation, and it's always, well, what could we have done better? And maybe what we could do better is to assign some of the blame to the rise of white nationalism in the United States.
Yeah, and I was thinking too about how kind of throughout your talk and this conversation, I mean, obviously this is a particular time, and so I don't want to make another false equivalency, but I mean, I think so much about, the 60s and early 70s and the kinds of social divisions that you're describing, Kevin. I mean, that happened around civil rights and Black Power and the American War in Vietnam. And I mean, as somebody who grew up with parents who were like, I guess what most people would call hippies, and, who were protesters or whatever during that time, I mean, the way they sort of, their alliances and the way that they wouldn't sort of, be friends, or certainly would never have partnered with somebody who, or have any affiliation with somebody who was like against civil rights or against, or pro Vietnam or whatever. I mean, so that feels really akin. So I also, and I mean, obviously we can go back further. We can think about, the Reconstruction era. We can think about the Civil War. I mean, while I do think this is a distinct period, obviously, and there's the new kinds of media are really important to recognize, this isn't the first time where, Americans have been deeply socially divided. It won't be the last. And the kinds of things that Jackson's talking about in terms of like white nationalism, I mean, again, it's also no accident that those other historical moments were also about white nationalism, and were also about a kind of, white lash to the perception of Black advancement. And of course, all of this was brewing during, the election and then the 2 terms of Barack Obama. And so I think it is helpful to isolate it as white nationalism, because it reminds us of the other historical eras in which we've seen social division deepen, and it is inextricably bound to white supremacist kinds of vigilante, actions and beliefs.
And maybe there's an opportunity for new forms of solidarity or more solidarity to replace what's been lost, right? In terms of friends, family, identity. At the same time as we've seen people lose those things and we've lost those things ourselves, we also, at least I'm seeing new connections among students and between me and my students and in my community, like meeting all of you today, right? Like I'm meeting new people who are who I never knew. I had this vision for a better world. And so there's a positive side to it too, which is like building those new solidarities around a vision that's not seen as partisan as much as around values, right? Like, what do we value as human beings? And celebrating that and not apologizing for it quite as much. I feel it, when I come back from a family Thanksgiving, which I didn't this year, but, something like that. And you just feel, those of us who have more empathy and compassion blame ourselves when we have disagreements, right? And so there's just like this tendency, I think, to look inward, which is important. But we could build something out of this, I think, too. And I think we are building something.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ambria.
I was just gonna say, I was gonna piggyback off what you were saying about how, like, before Trump, even though you don't like to put like his name in it, there wasn't really like division amongst family members and stuff. But like, I don't feel like that's picking like who you affiliate with based on your political views. I think it's more of like a moral thing, like not Republican or Democrat, but morals, like right. How can you support someone who doesn't care as much about the equality and just the treatment and everything that he like kind of stands for, so I don't think, like, I've had a friend who she goes to Ball State and she literally like wasn't invited to her family's Thanksgiving because she's not a Trump supporter. And it's like, I even invited her to mine. I'm like, girl, like, it's okay. Like, we support you. We thank you for supporting us, but because she supports Black Lives Matter, like they like literally, even her dad, like just disclaimed her. And I don't know. I feel like at what point do you stop caring about that acceptance that was brought up earlier and focus on your morals and your values, especially at this age, because we're out of our parents' house, most of us, and it's time for us to start making our own decisions and our own choices.
Yeah, thanks, Ambria. And it's something that queer people know well, right? Like, that's the other thing. Some people don't have a choice. Some people are cast out, early. And so I think there are lessons to be learned also from us queer folks who are more used to that, whether it's the political passing, or the identity passing, or the rejection. It's something that has always been there in a way. Cool.
Well, we've ended on a really positive note, so I can't imagine there will be a better moment. Plus, it's 6:30 here, so we do have to relieve the Kennedy Reference Desk of their duties. I want to thank Jackson Bartlett for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful conversation. So let's give him a silent hand over Zoom. And thank you to everyone else. I see Maya and Ambria and students from Philosophy of Race are still engaged here in the chat box. So I'll let that open for a couple minutes, but then Kennedy Reference will be logging us off. And I'll see the rest of you, I hope, sooner rather than later. Big Questions, Big Ideas will be back in January. In the meantime, I wish everybody a happy holiday season.